Elmer Dixon, I'm so excited to welcome you for an intercultural talk. So, Elmer Dixon, you are amazing. 30 years experience in diversity, inclusion, and equity, living it, breathing it, leading it. As part of, as president of Executive Diversity Services, I am excited to talk to you today. We were going to talk about communication. So I know you have such a breadth of experience with diversity, equity, inclusion. There's so much talk now on unconscious bias, and you have said that a lot of that relates to communication style, that it's not always what you see, but what you hear that impacts how people perceive you. So I was hoping you could talk about what is that intersection of like diversity, well, I guess the influence of culture on communication, and then what that means for unconscious bias.
Okay, well, let me kind of just back up a minute because I think that when when you intersect unconscious bias with um, diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and we've always had that intersection. But of course, before unconscious bias became a thing, we didn't call it unconscious bias. We called it stereotypes, which is a close cousin, a kissing cousin, in fact, because they manifest themselves in much the same ways. The brain science around unconscious bias talks about triggers that we get when we see images or we see people, we see things, and it connects to either past images that we've seen, information that we've heard, that creates this bias. And it's the same thing for stereotypes. And so we've always used that in our work. But as we intersect those two and look at the initial thing that happens, I refer to it as physiognomy, the practice or art of reading faces, which is something that has gone on for centuries, thousands of years.
It was kind of a pseudoscience a long time ago, wasn't it?
It was kind of a pseudoscience. But if you even, I often use the example of King Tut. And I don't know if any of our viewers have had the pleasure and the opportunity to see either of the Tut exhibits that came to the United States, but I often refer to the first one that came, the original one in the 80s, which in which they actually brought the sarcophagus, the burial mask, which was so incredible, and it was designed that way with this in mind, that whoever gazed upon it, of course, it was never intended to be gazed upon by mere mortals. It was in the afterlife that that it was to be gazed upon until 3,000 years later, a couple of guys from England went and dug it up. But when you see it, you get this impression of this magnificent king who was 12, 14 years old. I think he was 12 years old, the 12-year-old boy king. And, you think of a 12-year-old, you don't think of magnificent. But when you look at this mask, that first impression that you get, that's physiognomy. When we see someone for this first time, we immediately get some ideas about who that person is. And that's really where bias begins. If we have a bias against a color of someone's skin or gender or whatever other things may be visible, because those things aren't always race is certainly not visible all the time, but we do see color and we respond to it. And so once that happens, so the unconscious bias is set in motion now. And we work around what we call the 3 paradigms of unconscious bias. And so generally, the first paradigm that you're going to experience if you interact with that person is whatever comes out of their mouth when they say something to you. And that really is the essence of communication styles, is the way it comes out of someone's mouth. And of course, then So that paradigm of unconscious bias,
Hmm.
which is what we hear when we begin to communicate. If it is a style that I am comfortable with, and usually that's because it's like my own,
Hmm.
then I'm pretty good with the conversation.
Hmm.
And in fact, it's important to note that unconscious bias doesn't mean that I always have a negative reaction to someone. When the data began to come out around unconscious bias, it said that 80 to 85% of whites in the United States have a bias either for their own or opposed to or against African Americans or Black people. And so it's a unconscious bias really causes us to prefer people that are like us, or in this case,
Hmm.
styles that are like our own.
Well, can you
And
talk a
so,
little bit about what those styles are and then how they align along like race or cultural lines?
certainly. Um, so when you think about style differences, each of us have five primary styles that we use daily, every day. And our styles array across five different continua. So in our work, we look at, as an example, direct, indirect, and storytelling.
Hmm.
And so we're somewhere along this imaginary continua that you can't see right now. But and some of us are solidly on each one of those three. Others of us are somewhere along the continua between one or the other. And we do have ability to flex our style and adapt our style. But it's more difficult than others. The other continuous or style differences that we talk about in our training are what we call high context and low context. Low context meaning I need to use more words to understand what you're saying, or to make sure that you understand what I'm saying, and then vice versa. When you speak back to me, I want to hear some more explanation. High context is limited use of words because I have enough, let's say, contextual experience in whatever event I'm in, and I'm going to be brief when I talk. I'm going
Hmm.
to use it. It's almost talking in parables when I give you my information and expect you to be brief when you respond back.
That
Then
one is really interesting, only because that one I know once I learned that through you, it clarified why I never dated in college because I am so low context. Like you've got to really literally use the words. And even then I'm gonna be like, wait, so you like me or not? Like
so you
that
were
one.
low context and direct, right?
You're right.
So, so you're
Exactly.
driving you're
So
driving the guys away because it's like information overload, too much information. And when they're sitting there like stunned, like what the heck is all of this? And you're saying, then your directness kicks in, and you say, "Do you like me or not?"
why
You know,
not? Like right?
the interesting thing, Deanna, is that in almost every training, people, when they get a chance to either evaluate or talk to us afterwards, say that they found information that they can use both in their professional life at work
Mhm.
and also in their personal life with, at home, or, if they're interacting with someone else in their family or friends. So it does cross over, the information does. So it's interesting that you said that. The third one on the continua is fast pace or slow pace.
Mhm.
The speed with which it comes out of my mouth, and also the speed with which I expect you to respond.
Mhm.
And we look at dominant U.S. culture where the norms are, expectations are, and of course in the U.S. we're much more fast paced. However, there's regional differences in the U.S.
Mhm.
In southern states, people tend to take their time. And one of our former business partners, Andy Reynolds, used to say that, and he was from North Carolina. He used to say that when things are hot, like they are in the South, you don't want to move too fast, because it makes you hotter, right?
Oh my God. I just thought the video froze. So
So, so we look at
That's so
fast pace
funny.
and slow
Yeah,
pace,
sure,
and of
sure.
course we're along the continua on each of these. We
Hmm.
look at formal and informal, whether
Hmm.
I address you in a more formal way, Mr., Mrs., Ma'am, or Sir, and observe those protocols, or do I jump to a first name basis, or even change your name, or just say, "Hey, dude," or "Hey,
Hmm.
girl," "Hey, woman," "Hey, sister," whatever. Um, that's a more informal approach. And the dominant U.S. culture is one of the more informal cultures on the globe. And of course, someone who is more formal, if they are called anything other than Mr., Mrs., Ma'am, or Sir, I think that you're rude. If you start calling people outside of their name, then it becomes disrespectful.
Hmm.
So rather than say Deanna, I say, "Hey, D." But if you're a formal communicator,
Hmm.
that's highly disrespectful.
Hmm.
And
I've
then,
actually noticed that, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but even within the Black community, elders, I've noticed people will call elders, Mr. So and so out of respect. And so if I'm coming as, I, I don't know if you'd call it white, but white direct and wanting to connect, I would use a first name. And I myself have felt uncomfortable doing that when I listen to everyone else, and I realize that's not what's appropriate culturally there.
yeah, well, and it's so you uncovered two things. I think there's some
Mhm.
regional differences because in again in the South, more formal, and in the Black community, more formal in the South, and also generationally.
That's true.
My
True.
grandmother used to say, "Boy, everybody's got a first name. It's either Mister or Mrs." As she and so I have that more formal background because of her, and actually both sets of grandparents were from originally from the South, and so you just kind of follow them. Of course, if you trace history and look at the Great Migration North is what it was called in the actually that Great Migration happened between the early 1920s all the way through 1970, where Black families migrated from the South up north, or in some places, some to the West. And so you'll find that as part of our our culture, our co-culture, if you will, because of those influences from the South. Um, and so and then the last one, which is the one that we spend most time on in training, um, is detached, attached, and intuitive. And I'm sure you're going to ask me what those mean, but the reason why we spend more time there is because the element of emotion is introduced. And when you introduce emotion into a conversation, if I'm used to the emotion, it feels okay, it feels normal. If and I'm comfortable with it. If I'm not used to the emotion, the presence of emotion in I begin to label. And not to say that people that use emotion in their conversation don't label, because they can label the person who doesn't use it as cold, uncaring, calculating, etc. And so that's where you find the
I
most
thought it was more
critical.
you. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you
Go
off.
ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and I thought that you had said that was about building trust. Like if you're trying to have a conversation with someone, some people build trust if there's no emotion, others build trust when
Well,
there is emotion.
and I think that what you just introduced here
Mhm.
is the third paradigm. We've
Mhm.
skipped over the second paradigm. The third paradigm is conflict styles.
Mhm.
How do we respond in conflict? Because with regard to emotion in conversation, the trust may not be as big a thing yet. The first thing that happens if I don't see emotion, if I'm an attached communicator, and I'll just say that attached communicators express with emotion, and that is how both they come to meaning. How do they interpret what you're saying, and that is also how they come to truth. And so it is whether or not I trust what you're saying, whether or not it's truthful
Mhm.
when it comes to communication style. Is it the truth? If you've ever heard somebody say, I ain't feeling you, it's like, I
Mhm.
don't believe a word you're saying because there's no emotion coming out. And so it's around truth or not. Likewise, if you were to take someone who is detached, which is less emotion, they come to truth and also make meaning out of what you say based on whether or not there are facts and information. And it's truthful when, in fact, those facts and data are presented in a non emotive or expressive way because
Mhm.
it's just data and information. The thing around trust is really associated more with what is going on during conflict because there's more at stake. So if I'm even in lower levels of conflict, if someone uses a conflict style that also uses emotion, and that's uh, the style that is called. I knew it was going to slip out of my head. I'll come back to it in a minute. But the conflict style that relies on emotion, um, things are a little bit tentative. If when we're in conflict, even at the lower stages. I often use Sandra Bland as an
Mhm.
example. The death of Sandra Bland. That when the cop pulls her over for what eventually she finds out is a tail light, and and he comes up to the window in a very non emotive. So it's both the communication style as well as his response in conflict that's going to play out here. Is that so? He uses no emotion, so she's not sure if what he's saying is he's being truthful when he says, I pulled you over for a tail light. And so as it begins to escalate and she says, a tail light, I don't know what you're talking about. See, there's both emotion in the communication style, in her attached style, and also the conflict style that I'm thinking of is engaged,
Mhm.
which means trust is built through emotion. He's not showing any, so now her trust level goes down. So they're in trouble on two fronts. One, because he's using a detached style. She's not sure what he's saying is he's being honest, and he's using what we call a um, see the I wasn't prepared to talk about complex styles right away, but he's using a discussion style in his response to conflict. And so as the conflict begins to escalate, he shows even less emotion if he showed any at all. And as he hears her, in fact, responding with emotion, his trust levels going down. So they're going in opposite directions.
Mhm.
But that's the third paradigm of unconscious bias. And we usually don't do that in an initial training because
Mhm.
it's more of an advanced training because you're connecting both communication style and conflict styles often when you're doing that work. But we do it with cops
Mhm.
right off the bat
Mhm.
because they're in conflict most times when they're
Mhm.
even just pulling somebody over, even
Mhm.
asking, when they're interacting with a citizen on the street.
Right.
There's a hesitation, especially in the Black community.
Mhm.
Of course,
Elmer,
it's
when
full of
you do
police.
the train, just say that last thing. I'm sorry.
I said Black people historically have
Mhm.
not trusted the badge um, because of historical reasons. So
Mhm.
even if a cop is saying, "How are you today?" I'm fine. It's kind of like,
Mhm.
you know,
So let me ask you a question, because obviously the trainings that you do are about diversity and inclusion, not specifically communication styles. So where is that intersection when you talk about communication styles with diversity and inclusion?
well, diversity simply represents the all of the characteristics that one might have that also are present in a workplace, for an example. So do you have diversity along primary characteristics, which are things like race, ethnicity, gender, age, sexual
Mhm.
orientation. Secondary characteristics include things like religion, political ideology, et cetera, et cetera. And so we all have these various diverse characteristics, and they are part of, and they can be kind of seen as cultural overlays because we not only learn a dominant culture, but we have these co-cultures that we learn. Some people call them subcultures. And so where the intersection is with unconscious bias, with communication styles, you know, if you're trying to create one, if you're trying to value differences, you have to have a value for different styles and behaviors. And getting to that place is much easier said than done. If you're going to create inclusion, you then have to not only have a value, but you have to accept those different styles as relevant. Um, and then if you're moving beyond even just inclusion to cultural competence, then you have to be able to adapt to different styles. So the intersection is immediate. The fact that you have, you know, it's interesting that in a lot of organizations that I work in, that we've worked in over the years, people say, "Yeah, we've got diversity in our workplace," but it's not just enough to have
Right.
diversity.
As long as everybody speaks very succinctly and to the point, that we're good, right?
Well,
Because workplaces are normed around that, which I understand is sort of that Western European,
the
very
dominant
direct
U.S. culture.
style. Oh
This
my
dominant
gosh.
U.S. culture,
Yeah.
and the dominant U.S. culture,
Yeah.
just to correct you briefly,
Yeah,
is
please.
based in Northern European Anglo male culture behaviors. Now,
Okay.
it is a Western culture here in the United States, but
Mhm.
it's based in dominant U.S. culture is based in Northern European Anglo male behaviors. And if we were any of us that were raised in the United States, doesn't matter what color you are,
Mm,
we have that as our dominant cultural umbrella. It's like
mm.
whenever you travel to the U.S., doesn't matter what color. I mean, travel outside the U.S. and travel to a foreign country, doesn't matter what color you are. If you are raised in the United States, and I didn't say
People
born,
will
raised,
but people will
you
know.
know,
People will
people know.
automatically, oh, for
They
sure.
know.
Yeah.
I, you
Yeah.
know, there was a woman that used to be on our team. She was a Korean American, born and raised here in the United States. Her mother was born in Korea, but she immigrated. This is now when I use this example. She immigrated somewhere in the 1940s, and then her daughter Martha was born here in like 1950 or whatever. And so when the Summer Olympics were held in Seoul, South Korea in 1988, for those of you that have Olympic history, 1988 was the Seoul Olympics. So Martha says to her mom, you know, it's a great opportunity for you to go home. You haven't been home in 40 years. And her mom said, okay, yep, let's go. So they booked the flights. And a couple of things that happened right away that Martha noticed. When they got into the Olympic Stadium, her mother looked around and said, my God, Martha, there are a lot of Koreans in here. Martha said, "Well, we're in Korea," but
That's funny.
the thing was that it had been 40 years since her mother could look in crowds of people and see her own face looking back at her. It was like a like an experience that she had forgotten. But more to the point, when they were out, walking through the old neighborhood or walking to go shopping, they could be walking and someone would spot them as far as a block away, someone that knew her mother
Mhm.
and would say, who's that American walking with you?
Hmm.
See, they could see her mom and know her mannerisms and her gestures came, she's Korean because
Yeah.
her dominant culture was Korean because she was not raised in the United States like her daughter was. And they could spot her daughter a block away and knew that she was an American. So um, the influences of the dominant U.S. culture shape the workplace, as you were about to say, in
Mhm.
terms of what the norms are, what the expectations are. But here's the bigger challenge, Deanna, is that there's been multiple research pieces on this. That if you took homogenous groups and put them in separate groups and gave them the same workplace issues to work through, that each of the homogenous groups would come up with, and they're diverse groups, but they're in their own homogenous groups. They would come up with the same number of solutions to the same exact problem in about the same amount of time. If you then put them all together without information or training, and gave them a set of issues to work on, the same set type of problem, that it would take them twice as long to come up with fewer solutions to that problem. And what's the challenge? Why is that? Because they're doing this.
Mhm.
They're struggling over whose position is right. No, I see it this way. And so
Wait,
it's
so you're
not
saying they come up with fewer,
fewer
fewer.
fewer solutions, and it takes them twice as long to get to the solution.
Interesting.
So,
Because the studies also show that though that diverse teams, so what is
well,
it? Is it, I guess, is it
well,
with, that's where you're going, like with the training of,
here's the third part of the research.
I'm always like, if you ever tell me a joke, just tell me the punchline first. Sorry.
So, so the third part of the research says, so let's try this again.
Mhm,
Before we pull them together, or as we
mhm,
pull them together, let's provide them with some D&I training,
mhm,
baseline D&I training to understand styles and behavioral differences, so they
mhm,
could see strengths and weaknesses, not only of their own, but of the other style. And once they got that information, and then they pulled them back together, gave them a problem to solve, they came up with twice as many solutions as the first time when they were in homogeneous groups, and they
mhm.
did it in half the amount of time.
Um,
So the research says, Deanna, well-managed diverse
okay.
teams
Sure.
will consistently outperform homogeneous groups. So the key is well-managed. That's the intersection.
Mhm,
If you just put people together and let them play out their biases, that's what you have is chaos.
mhm,
And you see that in a lot of workplaces. People say, well, I'm going to hire, affirmatively and make sure I have diversity on my team and throughout the organization. But they
mhm.
haven't provided them with the tools and the information to work effectively together. So what happens? The minority employees and women will struggle initially, working hard to adapt to the cultural norm.
Mhm.
So once they adapt to the norm of the organization, things go smoothly, but they're still operating outside of their own styles and behaviors. So they can hit a glass ceiling. Women have to become more like men in order
It
to
feels
succeed.
like, which means they're just really stressed all the time at work too, if you're
They can
constantly
be
having to
stressed.
behave a different way,
Well, it's
or
always
that's
like
not natural.
it's like monitoring everything you say.
Mhm,
You have to monitor everything that you do to make sure that you're performing, based on the norm in the organization. That's how you marginalize people.
mhm,
That's why, uh, to get the most out of your team, everybody needs to be on the same page in terms of how do I effectively work with people who are different than myself? How do I value them so that we can include them and include each other so that we have an inclusive workplace? And so that's the goal of our training, is to get people to understand and value. Now, we when if you were to look at um, a model for developing intercultural sensitivity, there are a lot of models out there
mhm,
to kind of gauge where people are cross culturally, interculturally, et cetera. And we've used Milton Bennett and Mitch Hammer's model. They've split now philosophically, but the model's pretty much the same, but they've kind of gone in their own direction. But the original model, because it's changed now, shows ethnocentric and ethno-relative stages. I just used this in a training program the other day. And in ethnocentric stages, the three positions on the ethnocentric, the areas of ethnocentricity are: number one is denial, denying that culture even exists, that we're all just one culture of people. Defense, that says that once, okay, I agree that there are cultures, but mine is still better. And then there's a minimization, which minimizes differences
mhm.
in an attempt to, borrowing Rodney King's statement, get along. Can't we
Mhm.
all just get
I think it
along?
was that whole idea of multiculturalism when people are like, "Yay, let's all celebrate what we have in common."
Let's
Good.
celebrate
Yeah.
what we have in common. That
Hmm.
is exactly it. But the
Hmm.
thing about what we have in common, when we're looking for things that we have in common, where's our baseline?
Hmm.
That's a question I'm
Hmm.
posing to my esteemed colleague. When I
Oh.
say,
So, all right, now I'm
let,
blushing. Let me tell you why I'm blushing though, when you say where's our baseline. So the reason that I'm blushing is because I because I'm remembering all the phases and going through it. You know, I used to do all the exhibits and events at the airport. And so we're going to bring in the Romanian children dancers, and we're going to bring in the French, whatever, like the different groups.
yep, yep,
Then we said, okay, that doesn't make sense because you're isolating these things. Then we brought in pairs of groups. So we might have a Native American group doing drumming while we had a Japanese group doing origami. So they were at stages together and we saw more interaction with that. But I guess what I'm getting at is when we said, where's the baseline, is that, and this is the privilege of being white, is that it was so hard for me to be like, I'm white and I'm Jewish as well. And so when I started doing intercultural work, I realized it was always like, well, how do we work and help other people? But I wasn't willing to say who or what I was. And what's funny on top of that is saying I'm Jewish. I hated telling people I was Jewish because I thought, well, then they're just going to throw all these stereotypes onto me, which, if you're not wearing that, right there is privilege. If you're not wearing your race or your ethnicity on your skin, you have the
yeah.
ability just well, I'm just going to be me. I'm just going to
Just
be me. I don't
disappear.
need
Yeah,
definition. Yeah, I
yeah,
just appeared out of
yeah.
nowhere. So I'm
Well,
blushing because, yeah, I know it's like, well, no, I'm the norm, Elmer. Isn't that what you're asking?
well,
So,
here's the other part of that point. So when people are saying, let's focus on the commonalities,
mm,
and they find something that's similar, then the person says, "Ooh, that's just like me."
mhm,
So looking for things in common, can't we all, focus on similarities means similar means like me.
mhm,
It doesn't mean like
mhm.
you.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
means like me. And so in minimization, people really are ignoring the differences while they're trying to find
Mhm,
this
mhm.
similarity that
Sure,
we can
sure.
land on, right? And then there's the great divide between ethnocentric and ethno-relative.
Mhm,
And ethno-relative stages, there are also three places in the ethno-relative stages. The first one is acceptance. And acceptance says that I accept other cultures, I accept other styles and behaviors and ways of seeing the world as relevant as my own.
mhm. Yeah.
In our training programs, that's where we try to get people to move to eventually.
Mhm.
We
Yeah.
give them the information that allows them to eventually get to a place where they can see those other styles as relevant. They can see those other styles as just as effective as their own. And that takes work. The next stage in ethno-relative is adaptation. And adaptation is where you can adapt your style to the styles of
To
others.
the other person. Yep.
And that also takes work. That's where cultural
Mhm,
competence really begins. Inclusion starts with acceptance. Cultural competence really starts with
mhm,
adaptation. And so, I always ask participants to try to identify where they believe they are along this developmental model, and it never fails. I mean, I don't want to name any of my clients. I was doing a virtual session the other day and asked them the same question, and um, no one put themselves in. Very few people are in denial. No one
mhm,
put themselves in defense, and I wouldn't expect people to identify defense because the example I use for defense are people that say, you're in America now, you speak American, whatever that is. You speak English, right? And no one's going to admit to that.
mhm,
But then I think there may have been one out of the 25 that said they were in um, minimization.
mhm,
And then the rest of them were either in acceptance or denial, they thought.
mhm,
If you look at, um, in most workplaces, in all of the workplaces where we've done that, we've worked in, where we've assessed director level people in particular, most people fall in minimization and never know it unless they take the IDI, and it'll give them their results back.
Mhm.
And the reason why most people in the US fall in minimization is because their heart's in the right place, but they want to find something that's comfortable and safe. And it's easy not to see difference. See, one of the big things that has come up in this whole Black Lives Matter movement is exposing what really is behind someone saying, I don't see color, I don't see race. Well, so I'm invisible. And so by not seeing color or race, I want you to see me. I want you to see my color. I want you to see my race and ethnicity as much as you can see it. I want you to see the fact that for me, I'm male. I want you to see those things because it at least lets you know where we begin. If you're pretending that we're all the same and that I'm like you, I'll never be white. I'll never be a woman. Okay, and so
Mm. Well, you've also talked, when you talk about maximizing teams, it's the idea of how can you have people bring their full selves, their full skills, everything that they offer to a team
absolutely,
if it's being negated. Now, do you think there's
absolutely.
a, Robin DiAngelo has been so popular. She's been on all the talk show shows, this idea of the white fragility. And
Mhm.
some people I've heard say, well, that having to acknowledge difference means you have to talk about race. But I guess that's one question, is does that mean you have to talk about race, or is it embracing styles, and that white people have been protected from having to do that, so that it's a way of just not having to have those conversations?
Well, I think it is a way of not having the conversations. I think that
Mhm,
it's kind of like you're pretending that someone
mhm,
is not who they are, and
mhm,
it's like this the issue. It doesn't have to come up in a
mhm.
conversation,
Right,
but if
and it
you're
doesn't have to be about, that's the thing, is it feels like there's that fine line where so many people are saying we have to talk about race, we have to talk about anti-racism, but that feels different than we have to see people who they fully are, understand styles and how that contributes to the workplace.
absolutely, absolutely,
Mhm,
it's different. See, I think we're in a different environment now where the need to have conversations around race has been pushed forward, and
mhm,
that's largely been driven by the series of events that have happened over the last couple of months. And that's because people have failed and pushed away from having that conversation. You helped me write this. In fact, you wrote and used some of my comments, or maybe I wrote it. The letter from the president. I guess I did write it.
that one was
Um,
you.
that one was me. And in that
That's funny.
letter, which initially was an email to a friend, a colleague
Mhm,
in Finland, and I shared with him, and it's stated in the letter that when I travel to Europe, I feel more at home in Europe than I do in most European countries than I do here in the U.S. Um, and and that is not to say that there's not racism, obviously, in Europe. Europe's history is filled with racist acts. But the one thing that's different is that Europeans have admitted to and exposed their history for the most part, um, and come to grips with their past, their racist and um colonialist past.
mhm,
Um, Not all countries, because there's some of them that still have a lot of work to do, but for the most part. And so, and because of that, and they also don't have the stain directly of slavery. Most of them don't, although some of them were engaged in the slave trade, but having slavery within their society, as to the extent that we had it over here. And so that stain is here, and the U.S. has never, people in the U.S. have never owned up and admitted or accepted that fact. You hear people say, well, I never owned a slave. What happened, 400 years ago or 300 years ago or 200 years ago. I never knew those people. But see, the stain, on this country continues to exist, not only because of slavery, but even because of the events that happened since slavery. And so we haven't had the conversation. People don't want to have the conversation. And so now, because of recent events, people want to have that conversation. And so I think it's important to understand that there are a couple of different things going on here. People in this heightened awareness, people are wanting to and expecting to and need to and want to have those conversations. And when I get requests for those, I tell them that I can help you have that conversation. I can help facilitate that conversation, but I'm going to teach you a dialogue tool first, because we don't know how to have conversations without fighting, which is why people are afraid to have the conversation. We're a debate oriented society, and debate is the wrong method of conversation to have when you're discussing difficult topics like race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, any of those very volatile topics. And I forgot where this portion of our conversation started. I think it started with.
Well, I was talking about the difference between people wanting to have conversations about race, and then also communication style in the workplace. Because the
Yes.
comment that I said was, do people, and I'm just going to say, particularly for white people, I talked about Robin DiAngelo and the white fragility. Are you able to not have a conversation about race if you're saying, well, let's just talk about our style, and where those two things?
No, I don't think you can talk about style differences without bringing in the elements of gender and race. We're not anti-racism trainers. That has not been our curricula. There are some people that do a very good job of doing anti-racism work. Historically, what we used to call isms training was always confrontational. And there are some very good trainers today that do it in a way that it's not confrontational, but there are still confrontational anti-racism trainers. In fact, one of my potential clients, and they're a client now, but they had heard that the city of Seattle was putting white employees through a training on white fragility or something. And I can't remember what the name of the training was. And she asked me, if we were involved in doing that? And I said, no, that's not our approach. And that would appear to me to be very confrontational, is singling out a population and making them go through a training like that. And that's happening apparently with City of Seattle employees right now. But our approach has always been a values-based approach, but it's been coupled with the need to blend in the implications of race and gender. And so let me give you an example. So going back to the style differences that we talked about earlier, you being a direct communicator as a woman, you are, based on the research, you are opposite of the style that 55 to 88% of the women in the United States have, which is an indirect style. So you're what we call a cultural outlier. And so if you are working in a corporation and the dominant U.S. culture is, the dominant U.S. cultural preference is directness. And it's based on the origins of dominant U.S. culture. So white men, as an example, 55 to 88% of the time are going to be direct communicators. So it's expected. So if you interact with and talk to one of your colleagues who is a white male who uses a direct style, how are they perceived at work? As what?
Well, they're. I love it. I didn't know this was going to be on the test. No, they're if that's the normative style at that company, they're considered confident, direct, a go-getter. They can get their work done because they're spot on. They're smart
and leaders.
Yeah.
And so you come into the boardroom with that direct style of yours. How likely are you to be perceived?
Hopefully, if they're listening to my style, well, but sometimes like
No, they're not
people,
listening to what they're hearing your
okay,
style, but they're
okay,
trying to
then,
interpret your message. So, how are you likely
oh,
as a woman?
as a
Yes,
direct woman, I'm a
yes.
bitch.
So there's the B word.
Actually, yeah, yeah. I tell you where it
So,
was even. Oh, go ahead, and then I'll tell you where it was
so go ahead.
even. Oh, so where it was even worse was I worked for a really large social service agency where majority of the people who worked there, a lot of women, but they were social workers. And so that style was all about like, let's all, how do you feel about that? And I came in as a direct communicator. I felt I was constantly anxious because being a direct communicator in a world of social workers,
Yeah,
it was really hard. And people, I had all kinds of negative
yeah.
connotations for me.
But so
Me with this smile.
that's the interchange between
Yeah.
style and
Oh,
gender.
mhm,
See, and so now if you want to look at add color to the equation,
mhm,
you put a black woman, make you a black woman into that in that same conference room, then the labels get even more critical.
mm.
Um,
Well, I
and
know
and
I've
we
heard women of color say that stereotype of the angry Black woman.
yeah. Well, and so we look at that as an overlay in both direct, indirect, and also then even more so with attached, detached, and intuitive,
Mhm,
because the element of emotion is there. And so detached is facts, data, and information, as I said earlier. Attached is feeling based. Intuitive is you trust your gut or your
mhm,
heart. And if you were to look at the research around populations that use any of those three styles, again, dominant U.S. culture is going to be detached, facts, data, and information.
mhm. Yeah.
If you look, most of the rest of the globe are attached communicators. Most of the rest of the
Mm,
globe.
interesting.
And
Hmm.
so, if you've ever worked with, and I use this example in training, an Italian, and if you were to picture me as a white Italian
Yeah.
male,
My husband is Brazilian. So
I know
that's
your
why
husband's Brazilian.
when
Yeah,
we look at examples, I'm like, Where do I start?" Right?
that's
Of
that's
opportunities to practice this.
that's,
And
that's Southern European culture. He's
mhm,
Brazilian, but he's also got that Portuguese influence, which is Southern
mhm,
European, down in, at least if he's from the
mhm,
Algarve area. And then, of course, he's in
mhm,
Brazil. That's that Latin American influence, and so that's certainly an attached style. So the Italian guy at work is perceived as gregarious and fun loving.
mhm.
But then if you bring in a woman who is an attached communicator, and women in the United States, 55 to
Mhm,
88% of the time,
mhm.
white women are going to be attached communicators, more feeling based. So how is she perceived?
She's wasting time, she's not getting work done, all that kind of stuff.
She's
Yeah.
flighty, she's unprofessional, and don't let her, point her finger. Now she's
Mhm,
out of control, and there have been a few
mhm,
other adjectives
mhm.
that I've heard in the classroom.
Yeah. But then we've
And
talked about the benefit, though, is that then something needs to be done urgently. You know who has the relationships to like pull a team together fast and get stuff done,
yeah,
right?
but she still has to fight through those stereotypes
Mm.
of who she is. As you well know,
Mhm,
yeah, don't give her
mhm,
too much leeway because she'll strangle
mhm,
us in the long run, right?
mhm,
And then you add the element of color.
mhm,
So African Americans also, or Black people also, are normed 55 to 88% of the time to use an attached style. So the Black woman becomes the angry Black woman, or aggressive, personalizing. She takes things personal. I can't tell you the number of organizations and companies that I've been in where they have Black women have heard that exact, and Latino women have heard that
mhm.
exact same thing. And then you add the element, you bring it back around and put that attached style on a Black male. And now it's hostile and intimidating, and in some instances, dangerous. So, same style, and we went from a gregarious, fun loving Italian, white Italian male, to a unprofessional, flighty white female, same style, angry black woman, aggressive, personalizes style, black woman. That's the interpretations. To a hostile, intimidating, aggressive, sometimes dangerous black male. Militant is another word that I've heard. And I'm telling you, in most organizations I have been in, I have heard those responses across those populations. And an interesting thing happens when we do this training, because we don't point fingers. And I, in fact, say to people, you may not have done this. You may not do this, but someone in your organization does and has. And so what I tell them is we give them another tool, because all of our training is skills based, and we give people tools. And the tool is learn to listen for a style. And when you hear a style that is not your own, and one that makes you feel uncomfortable, when your gut wrenches up, then it's time to step out of the conversation for a minute, take the face out, listen for the style, and identify what style it is, and then use the tools that are most effective for that style, because we've just put them through that in our exercise, so that they walk away with, how do you do this? You know, how do I begin to flex and adapt my behavior? So we're actually helping our participants move along out of their comfort zone, out of minimization, and hopefully across that divide into at least acceptance. That's where the goal is. For managers and supervisors, we want to begin to push them towards adaptation. Because as a manager or a supervisor, it's inherent upon them to be able to adapt their styles. And I don't want to say that people can't adapt their styles. A lot of people do, but some more effectively than others, and also only up to a limit.
Right. And what you're talking about is people being able to adapt their style to a variety of different styles, depending on who the person is that they're speaking to. So
not only a variety of different styles, but in doing so, allowing those different styles to emerge as relevant, as effective, promotable. The biggest challenge that I've consistently seen in organizations across America is that while they've got a lot of diversity in the lower levels, the C-suite is still lily white, because the norms for what is professional are based on dominant U.S. cultural preferences. And you'll find women in the C-suite who have adapted their own style.
I'm sure they've adapted. Oh yeah.
To be like men.
Yeah. Yes.
And people of color have adapted their style to be like their white male counterparts. Lord knows if they said anything too loud in the boardroom, what would happen, or in the conference room or the executive meeting, if they raised their voice or showed any emotion.
Sure.
One of our longtime clients, and I won't use their name. I use their name often when I'm talking with potential clients, because I can lay the foundation. I don't have time to lay the foundation here. They've come a long ways. They've been awarded the highest award for overall diversity and inclusion program by an organization back in the Midwest, and you know who I'm talking about. But early on, when they were trying to increase their diversity at the director level, of which they had 200 directors across this large organization, they hired a black male. I was their first, and at that level, and so they had at least accomplished one part of their goal, which was to bring someone of color into that level. but he struggled for the next 5, 6, 7 years because there was still the expectation that he communicate like, work like with the
Mm.
same, you know, um, um, behaviors, and he was always in this, always in trouble with supervisors or his senior VP because of his style difference. And they didn't. Eventually, they figured out what was going on and were able to support him. But he struggled for the first 5 or 6 years. And so, in fact, we used to use an article in our training for managers and supervisors called "Dear White Boss." It's still a really written by a black male in corporate America. It's still a very valuable tool and learning tool in organizations. But the goal then is, as I said, is when you get to adaptation, it really then also uplifts the other style so that they're seen as relevant, as effective, and part of the team, and that style is embraced. So
Because then it
becoming
opens the door for others as well.
opens the door
So,
for others.
yeah.
Becoming cross-culturally competent, creating inclusive organizations that are equitable takes a lot of work.
Yeah.
You cannot pay it lip service. A lot of the requests that we get are just for training. A lot of the requests, want to do the rah rah, let's celebrate diversity. That's not going to get it. You have got to do the work in order to create a more inclusive and equitable environment.
Right, and have to do a lot of self-work as well.
Absolutely.
I could talk to you forever, and believe it or not, it's actually 5 o'clock already. So, yes, I know, and we could keep going forever. What I will do though, for anyone watching now or afterwards, if people want to leave comments or questions, we can take a look at those. I will also include a link in the comments to sign up for your monthly newsletter, which talks about a lot of these different topics.
Yep.
And of course, we always are happy to hear questions that people have to for future posts. Even you were talking about like the connection between, what is it, 1619, when the first African slaves arrived here. You've got a great article. I can't believe I just said that because I wrote that one. You, you have this really good article on your
Yeah,
site
yeah.
that tracks that like through, like, you cannot deny institutional racism. When you look at that, it tracks how the laws progress. So you've got some things like that are helpful as well. This is fantastic, and I think really illuminating, and it does work. Like you talked about, it's a practice, but once you sort of start with yourself, figure out who you are, and then how to adapt and see how other people are, it just becomes a way of life. That's
Yeah,
what's really exciting, because it just opens up, it just expands the world so
yeah.
hugely when you get to that point.
The
So,
number one characteristic of effective multicultural people is self-knowledge. It
mhm,
begins there.
yeah. So,
Okay.
thank you, Elmer. Always absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. And
My
I'm gonna
my
I'm gonna hang this
my
up.
pleasure.